Welcome, folks. As you probably all know, I'm Chuck Ogg, and I'm with the Rock County Progressives, and our mission is to promote education and activism here in Rock County. And um, we, used to meet regularly in the co-op. Now we meet regularly on Zoom, and we are a nonpartisan organization, and you know, we sometimes have politicians or people who are attempting to be so, or in this case, I guess someone running for judge. We don't endorse candidates, but we think it's important often to engage in conversation with such people, as they're often very knowledgeable on the issues, and on top of that, we can inform them in a sense of the things that we care about, issues and such. And so tonight I want to welcome a special guest, Angela Cunningham. And I think the recent events in Kenosha really have demonstrated to many progressives the desperate need for reform in the criminal justice system. Angela is a criminal defense attorney and candidate for Circuit Court Judge in Kenosha County Branch 6, having recently succeeded in the primary. As a judge, she will, according to her website, and I want to encourage folks to go to her website if you're interested in learning more about her or being part of her campaign at www.voteforcunningham.com. And as it says there, she will address immediate dangers to our safety while also making sure that every step of the criminal justice system works together to identify the causes of violence, providing safe spaces for victims to escape their abusers and heal and rehabilitate offenders. And if I know you're like me, you know that one of the problems in our criminal justice system is its failure to focus on that all important function, rehabilitation. Um, Angela has lived in Western Kenosha County since she was a child and is a graduate of Wilmot High School, where she ran track and played in the band. She graduated from UW with a bachelor's degree in social work and women's studies and a master of social work. She obtained her law degree from Northwestern Pritzker School of Laws. She currently serves on the Catholic Charities Board of Trustees and the board of directors for the Urban League of Racine and Kenosha. And this is the point where I usually say, everyone give her a big hand. And you can do that literally or down there with the little Zoom thing. But all right, so let's welcome Angela. Take it away.
Thank you for that great introduction, and thank you for having me here today. Again, my name is Angela Cunningham, and I'm a candidate for Kenosha County Circuit Court Judge Branch 6, and I'm running for judge to ensure justice for all in Kenosha County. My background and experiences up until this point of running make me the best candidate for this position. So just to give you a little bit of background about how I got where I am today, and then to dovetail into criminal justice system in general, and some things that I would like to address. So as mentioned, I grew up in Western Kenosha County. My mom, my sister, and I moved to Trevor, Wisconsin when I was just 12 years old. And we actually helped build our first home through Habitat for Humanity. I actually have really fond memories of being on the roof of our home while we were building it and hammering in shingles. When I think back on it now, as a 12-year-old, that probably wasn't the safest place for me to be, but it's definitely a fond memory that I carry with me to this day. Proud graduate of Wilmot High School, where I was actively involved in various things, as Charles pointed out. And I went away to college after high school, and after my first year of college, I became pregnant with my son. So came back to Trevor and tried to figure out what I wanted to do going forward. And then that's when I decided to transfer to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I completed my undergraduate degree in social welfare and women's studies and a master's degree in social work. I came back to the Kenosha area and worked in social services for several years. My most recent job before going on to law school, I was the executive director of the ELCA Outreach Center, which is a grassroots faith-based organization that was located in the basement of a church in the Uptown area here in Kenosha. And I worked with we provided basic needs services to people in the neighborhood. And a lot of the people that I worked with were low income. Many were homeless or one paycheck away from being homeless. And they had legal issues that were further compounding their already fragile situations. So they were dealing with paychecks being garnished because of past due debt. They were dealing with landlord tenant issues. They were dealing with custody placement issues with their children. And these are all civil issues. In the criminal court system, people have a right to an attorney, to have an attorney appointed for them if they can't afford to hire one, but that's not true in the civil legal system. And so I was trying to find people help with these legal issues, but there were very few resources available. So that's when I decided I wanted to go to law school so that I could come back to Kenosha and help people who were facing legal issues and couldn't afford to hire a lawyer. I got accepted into Northwestern. At the time, Northwestern was trying out a 2-year accelerated JD program for career changers, which was a perfect fit for me. And I picked my son up, and he was 10 years old at the time, and we moved to downtown Chicago so I could complete my law degree. Came back to Kenosha after law school, and I started my legal career at Legal Action of Wisconsin. And I was representing victims of domestic violence in family law actions for a number of years before going on to work at the Milwaukee Justice Center, which was located in the basement of the Milwaukee County Courthouse. I managed the legal clinic there to help people who couldn't afford to hire a lawyer to get free advice from volunteer lawyers and figure out how the court system worked. And then I went on to work at the Milwaukee District Attorney's Office, where I prosecuted primarily crimes of domestic violence during my time at that office. And from there, I realized that I was not able to be active in the community the way that I wanted to. I was still living in Kenosha and commuting back and forth to Milwaukee, working long hours as a prosecutor and not having the time to be actively involved in my community. So then that's when I made the decision to open my own practice here in Kenosha, ADC Law Office, where now I practice criminal defense law, and I also have a contract with the county. I'm doing guardian ad litem work. So that's kind of my background in a nutshell. So as you know, I'm running for judge now, and I think the moment when I made the decision I wanted to run for judge actually happened when I was at the district attorney's office several years ago. I remember walking into the preliminary hearing courtroom. So preliminary hearing is one of the very first hearings that it's a hearing that's held pretty early on in a case where someone is charged with a felony. It's a hearing that's held to determine whether or not there's probable cause that a felony was committed and that the person charged was the person who committed that crime. And so I walked into the courtroom as a prosecutor. And in the gallery, there was a sea of Black and brown faces, people who were there who've been charged with the crime, waiting for their cases to be called, or their friends and loved ones who were there supporting them. And separating the gallery from the rest of the courtroom was a plexiglass wall. And on the other side of that plexiglass wall were law enforcement officers who were waiting to testify in the preliminary hearings. There were defense attorneys, some of my colleagues from the district attorney's office, court staff, as well as the court commissioner. Everybody on that side of the glass was white. And I think it was in that moment, as I walked up to the door, waiting for the bailiff to buzz me in to get into the other side of the courtroom, that the huge lack of diversity in our court system and the huge disparities as far as criminal charges kind of smacked me in the face, right? That was a visual of the totality of the court system in one courtroom. And so after that day, I decided that I absolutely wanted to take my career at some point to a much higher level. And I started speaking with other judges and learning more information about what it takes to run for judge. But also, I think in that moment and pretty early on in my career as a prosecutor, I started being very vocal about some of the disparities I was seeing and trying to come up with solutions to address them. The district attorney in Milwaukee, he is known for being very progressive and for thinking outside of the box, for trying to figure out ways to help improve the disparities in the criminal justice system. He's known for being transparent about charging decisions that are made by the district attorney's office. And so I absolutely appreciate him for that, because not a lot of DAs are that transparent or are that aware of some of the disparities that exist. So I felt very comfortable going and talking to him about some of the concerns that I had. I was in his office quite a bit talking about the lack of diversity in our office. Although we had lots of diverse assistants, you know, the paralegals and the secretaries in the district attorney's office were very diverse. The actual assistant district attorneys who were making charging decisions and prosecuting cases, there was barely any diversity. I think I was one of like 5 or 6 Black assistant district attorneys out of an office of nearly 100 assistant district attorneys, where most of the cases we prosecuted, the defendants were Black or brown. And part of that is the lack of diverse attorneys, even pull from the pool of attorneys, right? The pipeline of people who are graduating from law school and going into the legal field, there's a lack of diversity, or so there's that issue. And then a lot of people who go to law school don't go to law school to work as a prosecutor, because prosecutors don't make a whole lot of money, right? Most people go to law school because they want to get a job where they're going to make quite a bit of money. So that further reduces the pool of diverse candidates to work at a district attorney's office. So I get that that's something that's very difficult to do, to increase diversity in a DA's office. But I did have conversations with John about other ways to increase, I think, to increase awareness about implicit bias and increase awareness about just about cultural competency, and recognizing that one issue that I took was a lot of, especially the newer ADAs who were being hired by the office, were coming from communities and backgrounds where they had very little exposure to people of color. And so the only exposure they had was through the district attorney's office and through the criminal justice system. And all being human, you know, you start to make, how do I say this? You start to make opinions about what you see every day, day in and day out. Not to say that that's intentional, but I think that plays into kind of some of the systemic issues that we see in the criminal justice system. I do want to back up a little bit just to kind of explain the flow of the criminal justice system, because there are several different parts that have different roles that I think all feed into systemic issues that we see at a larger level, that all feed into the mass incarceration that we see in our state and throughout the country. So on the front end, you have law enforcement officers. Law enforcement officers are the ones who respond to calls about criminal activity. They investigate alleged criminal activity, and then they make a decision about whether or not to refer a person who has allegedly committed a crime to the district attorney's office. So if we look at the criminal justice system as like a funnel, the law enforcement is the widest part, in that decisions are made by law enforcement officers about whether or not to investigate a case. And then once they investigate, whether or not to pass that along to the district attorney's office to determine whether or not to issue charges. Now, officers do need to at least believe that they have probable cause before they refer a case to the district attorney's office. But they have discretion on deciding what they're going to refer to the DA's office and what they're going to let go. So when we talk about systemic racism in the criminal justice system, there's not a whole lot of information that exists about the decisions that law enforcement officers make about which cases to issue to send to the DA for charges versus which cases they decide to just let go, right? And this is one stop in the criminal justice system where I would love to see some hard and fast data. I would argue that even in Kenosha, especially in Kenosha, there's a lot of differences in decisions based on a person's race and socioeconomic status about officers deciding to send a case into the district attorney's office to review versus officers letting someone go with a warning or letting them go with a citation. And then from the police officers, from law enforcement officers, they refer cases to the district attorney's office. So the DA sees only a fraction of the incidents that law enforcement officers come in contact with, right? And so then at the district attorney's office, they're tasked with, one, making sure there's probable cause, but even going further, and this is one thing that I really absolutely appreciated about DA Chisholm, is not charging a case unless we felt that we had enough evidence to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. So making that decision at charging rather than charging a case and then trying to decide later on once somebody says they want a trial if we can actually prove it at trial. Different district attorney's office handle things a little bit differently, but you only need probable cause to charge a case, but you really should, as a district attorney, be able to prove that case beyond a reasonable doubt. And because any case could go to trial, and when you take a case to trial, that is a burden that needs to be met, and that is a really, really high burden. And so again, if we're looking at a funnel, there are a lot of cases that the district attorney's office will look at, and for whatever reason, either because they don't think they can prove it, or again, DA's offices have discretion, just like law enforcement officers do. Even if it's a case that they think they can prove, they could decide to move a case into a diversion program. Another thing that the Milwaukee District Attorney's Office had, which was wonderful, was pre-charging diversion programs. So maybe they could charge the case, but they felt that maybe this is a low-risk offender, a first-time offender, rather than giving somebody a criminal record, giving them an opportunity to address whatever it was that got them into the criminal justice system in the first place, to be able to get some assistance. So those cases never make it to the criminal courts, but yet they're still getting services and assistance. Or a case gets charged, right? And then a person ends up in the criminal justice system from there. The prosecutor, I always say the prosecutor is the most powerful person in the courtroom because they make a charging decision. They can decide to dismiss a case. Judges can dismiss a case if there is legal grounds for it, right? But a prosecutor could just dismiss a case because, maybe in the interest of justice, or, they have the discretion to do that, but judges don't. So that's one thing that I try to explain to people when they hear judge, they think, oh, a judge can fix everything in the courtroom, but they really can't. So where a judge comes in is prosecutor charges a case, now it's in the criminal justice system. Judges are part of making sure that the defendant gets an attorney, and it's an adversarial system. So a defense attorney's job is to make sure that their client's rights are protected, to make sure that the prosecutor and law enforcement officers did everything within the confines of the law. And if they didn't, the defense attorney is filing motions to make sure that any legal sanctions that are available to that defendant are upheld in court. And judges rule on those legal sanctions. Those are motions. So when you think of a motion to suppress evidence or a motion to to dismiss, those are decisions that judges make that are based on the law. Judges also come in to play in the criminal justice system, and their discretion becomes really important at the sentencing stage. So somebody has been arrested by a law enforcement officer. the DA has determined that they can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, so they've charged it. And so now we get to any motions that were filed, the judge has found that the case should still go forward. And so let's say the defendant gets to the point of being convicted, and whether that's because the defendant enters a plea deal or the defendant goes to trial and is found guilty at trial. The judge then is tasked with determining a sentence for that individual. Most crimes have a maximum sentence that a judge can't go over, as far as incarceration time and how much a judge can fine someone. Some crimes have a minimum sentence. Specifically, I think of a lot of OWI crimes. They have a minimum sentence. Like for instance, OWI second has a minimum of 5 days incarceration plus a fine. So when a judge is setting a sentence, the judge can't go over the maximum. And if there's a minimum, they have to give at least the minimum sentence. Most crimes don't have a minimum sentence. And so a judge has a lot of power when it comes to controlling mass incarceration, right? Because the judge is the person who ultimately sentences an individual to jail or prison. And there's a lot of factors that judges look into. The statute says that the judges need to look at the character, the person's character, the keeping in mind safety to the community, and also the nature of the offense that they've committed. So obviously, and judges have their own ways of figuring out those three things when making their sentence. But that's where it's important to have a judge who understands not just this funnel of how people end up before them, but also understands the dynamics of systemic racism and how that funnel, how people are weeded out of that funnel. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of data that shows it. There's a few studies that are popping up here and there that are studying law enforcement decisions. And I know one big study that was really popular several years ago was Stop and Frisk out of New York, where law enforcement officers were stopping and frisking people and trying to catch people in a crime, but they were targeting Black and Brown populations. And if you're targeting Black and Brown populations, you're more likely to find Black and Brown individuals who are committing crimes. I think to bring that back locally, that's one of the huge complaints in the Kenosha community. As a defense attorney, I hear from people all the time that they feel like their neighborhoods are over-policed. There's this idea of certain neighborhoods, especially Black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods, are over-policed but also under-policed. And you ask, how can a neighborhood be over-policed and under-policed? They're over-policed in the sense that because they're high crime areas, there's a high police presence. People are more likely to get stopped for minor petty things and find themselves in the criminal justice system because of that, because officers, when you have officers around looking for things, they're going to find things. But then there's the argument that minority communities are also under-policed because when there are serious crimes happening, or when someone's seeking help, they're not taken seriously. It's like a double-edged sword in the minority community a lot. And so that's where the race of a victim comes in, right? And understanding that minority victims who are frustrated and angry and may come off as being angry and loud aren't necessarily believed or taken seriously. And I saw that sometimes at the district attorney's office. And again, that comes in with the cultural competency and understanding the dynamics of race and systemic racism when working with individuals. I think sorry, I lost my train of thought. So going back to the policing, minority communities, there is a high police presence, so they're more likely to catch individuals who are committing crimes. I remember having a conversation with a group of individuals here in Kenosha shortly after all of the riots and protesting happened. And we were talking about systemic racism. And it's hard for some people to wrap their minds around what happens in minority communities, because people say, well, you know, there's a lot of crimes that happen in those communities, so of course there's going to be a lot more police officers. But you know, you turn it around and say, well, if there were more police officers in the more affluent neighborhoods that were pulling people over for minor infractions, such as rolling through a stoplight or speeding or having a tail light out, how many people would likely be caught with having drugs on them? We know there's been studies that said that drug use, especially marijuana use in minority communities, is about the same as it is in white communities, but minority communities are disproportionately charged and held responsible for those crimes. And part of that is the over-policing, right? Someone gets pulled over, cop smells marijuana, you're arrested for possession of marijuana. But if that over policing happened in more affluent neighborhoods, how many cars would get pulled over where marijuana may be found on an individual who's driving in a more affluent neighborhood? I don't know the exact solution because there definitely are areas where there are some serious violent crimes going on. And I'm not trying to minimize or say that police officers shouldn't try to minimize those crimes, but that's just food for thought when we're talking about how people end up in the criminal justice system. So being over policed in minority neighborhoods, ending up in the criminal justice system, and then it starts to snowball, right? Once you're in the criminal justice system, that affects all aspects of a person's life. It affects their ability to get housing in the future. It affects their ability to get jobs in the future. It affects their ability to maintain a family, right? If you can't maintain stable housing, if you can't get stable jobs, then it makes families unstable. So there's this snowball effect. And I think trying to dismantle it all is going to take more than just one system, one part of the criminal justice system. It's going to take everybody working together, from law enforcement officers to the district attorney's office to the defense bar, right? Because the quality of someone's representation definitely affects their outcome in a case. Someone who can afford to hire an attorney who can spend a large amount of time on their case and can hire experts and hire investigators is going to have a better outcome in their case than someone who gets a public defender who has a huge caseload and barely can stay afloat on top of their cases. And then also looking at the DA's office and how they choose to charge cases, and then going up to judges and how judges decide to dispose of their cases. Some of my friends that I worked with when I was at the district attorney's office in Milwaukee are now on the bench. And I had conversations with them about what it's like being a judge. And a common thing that came up is they feel like there's not a whole lot of options available to judges when it comes to holding somebody responsible for their actions. One specifically explained about a case that was before her. She said, you know, jail wasn't appropriate. He was going to lose his job. And she didn't feel like the offense he committed was an offense that warranted jail time. But a fine wasn't appropriate because he didn't have the money to pay a fine. And she didn't feel like that he would have, that it would have helped anything. Like he wouldn't have, it wouldn't have held him responsible in a way that she thought was appropriate. But she also didn't think that probation was appropriate either, because she didn't feel like he had any probationary needs. And so she said she was really frustrated because those are really the only three things that are available to a judge when it comes to sentencing. And so if elected judge, that's something that I want to delve deeper into, is the options that are available to judges for sentencing. And one of them is potentially restorative justice. I know we started having a short conversation about restorative justice before we started, but restorative justice, I think, is an opportunity to not only help hold somebody responsible for their actions, but they can see how their actions impacted others. And it also allows the people that they've impacted a space to heal and address whatever it is that they're dealing with as a result of being a victim of a crime. I feel that our criminal justice system right now, there's not a whole lot of room for victims to heal and feel whole and to feel vindicated. There are some victims that, you know, advocate for someone being incarcerated, whether it's an appropriate outcome to to what somebody's charged with or not, and they fight for that, and that's what they want, and that's what they all focus on. But that doesn't address the hurt or the loss that a victim has experienced as a result of being a victim of a crime. One thing I learned when I was at the district attorney's office is that there's a fine line between being a victim and being a defendant. Being a victim of a crime can be traumatic, and trauma causes all kinds of ripple effects. And one of them can be, you know, getting into a life of alcohol and drug abuse, which could lead to committing crimes. And then that victim from 5 years ago is now a defendant, you know, in the future in another case. And so to stop that cycle of abuse and stop that cycle of crimes, I think our courts need to look at ways to help victims heal, while also holding an offender responsible, and do it in a way that's still keeping our community safe. And I don't know exactly what that would look like. I'll be honest, I don't have all of the answers. I would be lying to you if I did, but I do know that we are at a point where we need to at least sit down and start to address it. I said that I had a previous career before coming into law, and I worked in social services. I also worked as a planning and evaluation associate for the Department of Human Services for a number of years. So I have experience with program evaluation, and I want to bring that to the bench, and also bring that to some sort of criminal justice reform talk in Kenosha County, to start to look at implementing some pilot programs and do it and do evidence-based work, and try to see some programs that will, one, help victims heal, while also holding an offender responsible, and doing a long-range study about how that what is successful in reducing future, not just recidivism for people who have been charged with the crime, but also reducing potential future criminal activity of people who have been victim of crimes. That would involve doing baseline studies, lots and lots of baseline studies. I'm a numbers person, so in order to know if something is effective, you need to know where you're starting so that you can show where you've gone. Another area that I would like to do a study is on the racial disparities in the court system. You know, I was really surprised to see a study that came out just maybe about a month ago. The study was completed a year ago, but it was just released to the public about a month ago, that was done on a statewide basis about the disparities in sentencing for prison. So the study specifically found that throughout the state, Black and Latino men are more likely to be sentenced to prison for a felony conviction than a white man, for similar felony convictions than a white man. And that study specifically said that in District 2, which involves Kenosha, Racine, and Walworth counties, Black men are 50% more likely to be sentenced to prison for a felony conviction than a white man. And that's the highest rate in the state of Wisconsin. I've always said that I knew that there are disparities. I sit in the courtroom and I see the differences in how Black and Latino defendants fare versus white defendants. And that's not to say that that's an intentional difference. I think it's way more complicated than that, but there's definitely a difference. So to hear that this study kind of validated my gut feeling just motivates me more to want to see much more in-depth study and to try to get to the root cause of those differences. Harvard did a study of the Massachusetts criminal court system. And Harvard is a reputable institution. And they concluded, and I don't remember the specifics of the numbers and the rates of disparity, but I do remember that they concluded that the disparities that existed in their criminal justice system, the only cause they could find was race. When they controlled for everything else, they controlled for criminal history, socioeconomic status, education. When they controlled for a whole bunch of variables, they concluded that race was the only difference, the only cause for the differences in outcomes in their criminal justice system. I think Wisconsin in general and Kenosha County in particular needs to do a similar in-depth study. And my hope is if we can get a study done, that will spark some serious conversations about reform. Because I think as long as it's a concept that people can easily write it off as it's not real, or or justify why there's differences, right? Black people commit more crimes, Latinos commit more crimes, and that's why there's more of them in prison. But like I said, that study that Harvard did show that definitely was not the case. And I hope to bring a similar study here so that we can start to have some real and honest conversations about the disparities and some real and honest conversations about being intentional to address those disparities. I've kind of rambled on, so I guess at this point, I'll open the floor and see if anybody has any specific questions about anything.
Yeah, this is usually the place where we open things up for Q&A, and now it's your turn to ask our speakers questions. You can do so by voicing them out loud, making sure, of course, to unmute, or you can put them on chat and we can read them to the speaker. Another way to ask questions. And I put her contact info up there, just the website in case anyone wants to contact the campaign further. So what do you think, guys? Questions?
I see there's one in the chat. Milwaukee 53206 is most incarcerated community in the country. Comment on school to prison pipeline. Excellent question. So in the schools, and there's been studies that have been done, I don't know that there's been studies specifically in Wisconsin, that shows that African-American students are more likely to be punished for their behavior in schools, and their behavior is more likely to be criminalized. So a young individual gets into a fight at school. If they're Black, they're more likely to be referred for charges to the district attorney's office. And once they're referred to charges, those charges are and they end up in the criminal justice system. Perfect example of that. I remember I represented a young man in a juvenile delinquency case. And he was facing some pretty serious charges. And we were able to resolve the case. And so we get to, in juvenile court, instead of sentencing, they call it disposition. It's the same thing as a sentence in adult court. So we get to disposition. And the DA painted my client as this, she made it sound like he was this terrible career criminal. Now, mind you, he's 16 years old. What was he charged with? What was his record? A possession of THC and a battery from getting into a fight in high school. And so talk about prison, the school to prison pipeline. He got into a fight at school, got caught with some weed on him, got referred to the district attorney's office for that, and ended up being adjudicated as a juvenile delinquent. So now when he gets charged with another crime, that compounds the potential outcome for his new case, right? And so rather than the school maybe suspending him for getting into a fight and having weed on him, they've started this snowball of a criminal record that the DA then pumps up every time he ends up back in front of the judge. So the school to prison pipeline is a huge issue, because even though juvenile records are not available to the public, right? An employer can't look up a juvenile's criminal record, but they're available to the DA. And the DA will make sure that the judge knows what an individual's juvenile record is, especially if that individual is young and they're not that far removed from being in the juvenile courts. And so every single time a person comes in contact with the criminal justice system, it builds on top of each other. And so that adds to kind of the systemic racism, right? It starts in the schools where one individual gets referred for charges, where another one just gets suspended from school. The person who got referred for charges, they get in trouble again. Now they have a criminal record. Whereas the person who got suspended, if they get in trouble again, it looks like they don't have a criminal record, right? So this is when I talk about systemic racism, it starts really in the schools and goes from there. And I think recognizing those disparities, ideally, we want the disparities to not be there from jump. So then by the time a person gets to the judge, everybody is on equal footing. And we know that somebody doesn't likely have a bigger criminal record because they received criminal charges because of their race. But that's not the reality that we're in right now, unfortunately. But I would like to work with the community to try to start right in the schools to make sure that everybody's being treated fairly and equally. So there isn't a difference of who gets referred for charges versus who gets dealt with in the school.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Other questions? Well, I have a few if no one else does, but I don't want to dominate.
Ken raised his hand.
Yeah, you mentioned marijuana arrests and stuff like that. Do you still see that? I don't know, it seems like the marijuana laws have been loosened. Do you still see that as a, I don't know, stepping stone, or lots of arrests with marijuana possession? Is that still a problem in our state?
I don't see them as standalone, right? I don't really see them as standalone, but it's usually if somebody ends up getting charged with something else that gets tacked on, is what I see. I remember when I was at the DA's office and we had kind of a general rule that we didn't charge possession of THC. We did those as a citation. But like I said, a lot of times if somebody has other charges and they had marijuana on them, then they would likely pick up a possession of marijuana charge as well. And one thing that I don't know if a lot of people are aware of, the first possession of marijuana charge is a misdemeanor. If you've been convicted of possession of marijuana, the second time you have marijuana on you, it is now a felony. It's possession of marijuana the second time is a felony.
It's not another misdemeanor?
I mean, in the DA's discretion, it can be a misdemeanor, right? The DA has a discretion to do that. But if they wanted to follow the law allows for it to be charged as a felony the second time.
Go ahead, Chuck.
Okay, let's see. I have heard that in a lot of places, judges, I think it's judges, use algorithms for determining sentencing. And one of the criticism is that these algorithms have built-in racial, prejudices within them. Is that true here? Do you see that as a problem?
So Kenosha does not use the algorithm. Milwaukee does. Well, they did when I was there. I assume they may still be using it. I feel like they're a double-edged sword, right? Because the idea is to take out the individual's personal prejudices or unconscious biases that they may have by putting in this theoretically objective calculation. But an algorithm is only as good as the people who put it in, and people who are putting together algorithms are still people, right? And it goes back to the way, remember how I explained going back to the school to prison pipeline analogy. An individual may have more of a criminal background because they were more likely to be referred for criminal charges versus being diverted to, a suspension or other in-school solutions to their behavior. So that algorithm can't take that into consideration, right? So an algorithm is going to objectively look at somebody's criminal record and what they've done, but it's not able to recognize that somebody who doesn't have a criminal record may have done the exact same things as somebody who does have a criminal record. So I think there's some benefits to it, but I think it does not solve the issue of systemic racism.
Well, let's see. I can think of other questions, but I don't want to dominate this. So your turn if you have one.
I have a question.
Go for it.
So I'm just kind of curious with what you're seeing locally in Kenosha, how things are going with building movements against systemic racism and against these problems. I know you mentioned, you were working with ELCA. I know that the churches have been doing some work. So I was just wondering if you could go into kind of the specifics of what you're seeing on the ground.
Oh, absolutely. There is a lot of people who are fired up and who are passionate about affecting change in Kenosha. And a lot of young people. You see a lot more people who are more interested in what's going on at the City Hall building. A lot more people, young people who are much more interested in what's going on at the county level, because they're starting to recognize that decisions are being made about their lives in these buildings and they're not at the table when those decisions are being made. There's also, the grassroots getting out and protesting crowd as well. I think there are people in all facets, right? I always say that a social justice movement involves getting out in the streets. It involves getting into the courthouses. It involves getting into and also getting into the state houses on all fronts in order to make lasting and systemic change. And so I'm really excited about the energy that's going on here in Kenosha. There's some growing pains as people learn their way, but I think everybody has the same ultimate goal. And the way that the community is coming together to affect change it's beautiful. That's the only way I can describe it. It's absolutely beautiful.
That's awesome. Do you see a way for you as a judge to be able to help these movements or to be a focal point or to platform them? Or is that something that you would probably have to stay away from as a judge to be impartial?
So I would have to, I can't be actively involved in them, right? because as a judge, I do have to remain neutral. And if any of them were to decide to bring any cases to court, I would potentially preside over them. But I still have a role as a judge to be actively involved in the community. As I mentioned, judges don't have, right now, as it stands, judges don't have a whole lot of options available to them when it comes to holding somebody responsible when they've been convicted of a crime. So working with some of these grassroots individuals and organizations, working with community leaders, working with some established organizations to try to come up with some alternative ways, alternative options for judges to have to hold individuals responsible. And also, I think working with those same individuals to try to address some of the systemic racism that exists across the whole entire criminal justice system. So we know some of the causes of people committing crimes include poverty, mental illness, alcohol and drug abuse, and then obviously systemic racism, which I've talked a lot about already. But as a judge, I would work with community members to try to get some services and programs in place to help alleviate some of these community concerns to reduce the crime, but then also to have available to me as a judge to sentence people to get help through those services, however that looks. Kenosha has a couple of treatment courts, including a drug treatment court and a mental health treatment court. So looking to expand those treatment courts, but that's going to involve getting the community to work together to have options available for us to send people to for treatment. So that's how I see myself as a judge working with some of those movements, more in ways that would directly affect my ability to do my job from the bench.
I was just going to comment, what an excellent candidate you are is really impressive, Angela. And your thinking is as deep and strong as many of the law professors that I had many years ago.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask, I'm going to ask a tough question. I know this is probably one of the more challenging ones, and I know there's no easy answers, but I know that many in the community feel frustrated about holding police officers accountable, especially when, they kill somebody in situations that, look like murder. It's just so difficult to get their convictions. Any thoughts on how that could be changed and what might be done?
So a lot of that starts with the law, right? Qualified immunity. So that's people rallying their elected officials to address that law. I think also a part of it is police officer training and the process on how police officers are hired could potentially be looked at. I think there's probably a whole list of ways that can be addressed, but one of the reasons why at the end of it, like after a death has occurred, and why officers are seemingly not held responsible for their actions is because the law, right? It comes back to the law. And so I think a lot of individuals and people in the movement are recognizing that advocating and getting involved in the legislative process is going to be part of the way that they affect change.
That's a good answer. I want to throw in one more question that Ken had asked earlier. I think we all want to congratulate you on your victory, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how that went and how you see your prospects coming up.
Absolutely. So for those who were not on the call early today, we had a primary election on February 16th. There were 3 of us in the race. I did come out as the top vote getter with almost 44% of the vote. So I was really excited to come out of the primary with such a huge lead. But the turnout was very, very low. So definitely not resting, not assuming that means I'll have a victory in the general election. I have a great team of people around me, from my campaign manager and her firm to just people who have rallied around me and came out to volunteer because they really believe in my background and that I would make a wonderful addition to the bench. And so we have lots of get out the vote events. I actually, in a couple minutes, going to be hopping off of here for a meet and greet. Several events coming up in the next few weeks. I invite anybody, if you'd like to join, to feel free to join any of our meet and greet events. You can find those on my website. That's over in chat. Also, if you're at all interested in helping to let voters know about me throughout the Kenosha County, we do have phone banking opportunities, which can be done from anywhere. But I'm just really excited and humbled by the support that I've gotten throughout the Kenosha community.
All right, we got just a couple more minutes. We could have one more
Yeah.
quick question. Go for it, Ken.
I got a little follow-up on that. How many judges you're running for a district, is it? It's not a county, is it?
It's a countywide race, but it's a branch. So we have 8 branches, but each branch is countywide. It's not any certain part of the county. There are 4 branches up for election this spring. Only 2 of the branches are contested. So I'm running for branch 6, and then branch 1 is another contested race. And then the other 2 branches are incumbents who are running uncontested.
So you'll be one of 2 judges in your branch? Is that the way I understood that?
No, I would be the only, there's 1 judge per branch.
Oh, okay.
There's 2 of us that are currently running for the branch, and then there's another branch that's also contested.
So is the branch is an area?
It's the entire county. So each
Okay.
branch is countywide. It's not like a city alderman where alderman has one part of the city. No, this is the entire county. Everybody in the county can vote for each branch, 1 judge per branch. I don't know if that makes sense.
A
So
little.
everybody who's there's four branches up for election that will be on the ballot this spring. Everybody in the county will be able to vote for 4 different judges, 1 judge per branch.
Well, folks, we should probably let Angela have a minute to take a deep breath and before she goes on to her next event. I want to thank her so much for this presentation. I'll be putting in the video up on YouTube, and everyone give her a big hand. Yay.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's really nice to meet everyone.
It was
Thanks so
so
much.
great having you. Thanks.
Best of luck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have a good
Excellent.
evening, everyone.
Have a good evening, folks. You all take care now. Hope to see you next month. Bye-bye.